As we're developing the course, we've been looking at really several aspects. We saw the understanding of culture. We've seen the pastor as a spiritual leader. This last segment I want us to look at is the pastor as an organizational leader. Now, as we, again, think of the small church, and really the church in general in the pastoral role, we have said, and we need to be reminded of continually, is that the pastor as a spiritual leader is primary in our responsibility. That's really the task of what we do. That's the proclamation of truth, the modeling of Christ, to transform people into the image and character of Christ. That is our primary role. That responsibility is normative to every church, to every pastor, regardless of the cultural setting. We are called to be spiritual leaders. How we do that will change depending on the culture. But still, our biblical call remains the same, to be spiritual leaders who proclaim truth. So it is biblically driven, so that our understanding of that role is derived from Scripture and applied to the context. Now, as we think about this next segment, and that is the pastor as an organizational leader. Now, it's important for us to understand that this aspect of leadership is just as critical. Now, certainly there is an organizational side to the church. The church is not only the universal spiritual bride of Christ, but there's a local identity, a local representation that involves organization. Now, what we see in the New Testament is that in the New Testament, there was organizational structures. For example, in Acts chapter 6, we see the appointment of deacons to take care of the distribution of assistance to the widows. So there was a program there. There was leadership in that program. And so we see hints of that in the New Testament. What we don't see is a prescribed organizational structure. We see that there was elders, there was deacons, there was deaconesses, but we really don't have prescribed for us how we're to organize the church, because that is much more culturally determined, so it's more adaptive. What they adapted in the early church was really the organizational structure and setting that was much influenced by the synagogue. But how we do the organizational structure is going to be much more determined by our cultural setting. So the organizational structure, and as a pastor, as an organizational leader, we need to recognize it's secondary in importance to our spiritual role and responsibility. It's adapted to the situation, and it's more culturally influenced. So as we think about leadership, especially on the organizational side, we need to understand our context in which we minister. And that's true in terms of how we lead, and how we exercise authority. So that leadership and authority, we need to understand how it relates in the context of the small church. Now, as we look at what is being written today on leadership, in recent years, as we look at the leadership style or approach within the context of church, is that there's been a movement to a managerial style of leadership. We have adapted the secular model, if you would, of leadership and the responsibility of that leadership. So that the focus today on leadership is upon decision making, it's upon vision setting, administration, and certainly there is much that the church can and should learn, even from the secular world, regarding leadership today. But the problem is, while that is effective in the larger church, when we come to the small church, we need to understand that much of that style is ineffective in the context of the small church. That this paradigm of the managerial side often comes in conflict with the paradigm of leadership, the cultural expectations of leadership in the context of the small church. Now, as a result of that conflict, oftentimes the small church has been labeled as unchanging, as hard-headed, as legalistic, as traditionally driven. But oftentimes what the problem has not been the fault of the small church. It's not that they're hard-headed. It's not that they're unchanging. The problem is not found with the people, but in our failure to understand how leadership and authority works within the context of the small church setting. And that's what I want us to explore in this session, is how do we understand leadership and authority in the small church setting so that we can be effective as spiritual leaders. Now again, as we think about preaching, preaching is bridging the biblical text with the contemporary setting. That's the task of the preacher. We live in two worlds. We live in the biblical world so that we understand what was written in a historical, cultural context, in its grammatical context, but we also live in a very contemporary world where we face issues and struggles that are in many ways unique to our culture. And so we need to be the bridge between those two worlds so that we take the biblical truth and we apply it to the contemporary situation. The same is also true of leadership. Now, as we think about leadership, as we view leadership, we view it again through two lenses. We view it through the lens of Scripture, that Scripture has a great deal to say about what it means to be a leader in the church. A good example of that is 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, where Paul writes these young men in ministry, and he has a great deal to say to them about what it means to be the pastor of a church. And so we approach leadership, first of all, through the lens, through the understanding of the biblical concept of leadership. But also we view it through our cultural context. And we need to understand that cultural context. So each culture really has a different way of approaching leadership. How one leads in America differs radically from how one would lead a church in, for example, Russia, where their approach to leadership, because of the influence of communism, they were much more dictatorial, and so there's a greater recognition that the person in charge has the authority, versus a democratic culture where we view the person in charge as someone who's been given authority by the community. And their only authority is what they derive from the permission of the community. And so the American culture has a much more congregational focus in its leadership style within the context of the church. If we're to be effective in the small church, we need to understand the paradigm by which the small church operates and approaches leadership. So that while much of the material today on leadership is written from a managerial corporate perspective, we need to recognize that in the small church it's a family perspective. Certainly, if one were to lead a huge corporation such as Microsoft or Chrysler or some other large corporation, the style of leadership he would use in that context would differ greatly from a family-owned business where the husband and wife run the business and they do all the operation and they maybe employ some of their children, maybe one or two other employees. But how one would lead within that context would differ radically from the mega corporation. And so it's true in the church. How one leads a large church will differ radically from how one leads a small church. And this is not to say that one is better than the other, and certainly, in fact, that both can learn much from each other. The small church can learn much from the large church approach to leadership. And the large church can learn a great deal from the small church context. But we need to understand these differences. One is not more important or more valid than the other, but they're just different. And if we desire to be effective, we need to understand the criteria by which the church operates and the congregation judges and views leadership. And if we fail to understand that, it will result in misunderstanding with the people, bringing frustration both to the pastor, to those in leadership, as well as to the congregation. So, as we think about the small church, the managerial model, manages by objectives. In the family model, it manages by relationships. Now again, in the small church, it operates like a family rather than a corporate business. It's a family relationship, and because of that, it bases decisions upon how it affects the family. In the larger church context, management is by objectives. In other words, we set out at the start of the year, what are our goals, and what is it that we want to accomplish, and based upon those goals and that direction, we develop policy and procedure that will serve to implement and achieve those goals. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is, that's not how the small church operates. The small church operates based upon relationships. So that rather than goals determining policy and procedure, in the small church, it's relationships and the effect things will have upon relationships that govern policy and procedure. So that within the small church, a decision, no matter how significant or beneficial, will be rejected if it is perceived to be damaging to the relationships that exist within the congregation. For example, the decision to replace the organ and the keyboard. Now, if we were in a larger church that's operating under a managerial context, we might say that if our goal is to reach the next generation, we want to reach young people. Because that's our goal, we will then replace the organ with a keyboard so that we can have a style of music that will enable us to be more effective in reaching young people. That's a managerial approach. In the small church, the decision to replace the organ with the keyboard will not be based upon that kind of a goal. It will be based upon what effect this will have upon Betty, who is the one who plays the organ for the last 30 years. How will it affect her? Will it hurt her? Will it cause her to feel rejected? And so in the family model, the decision is based upon how it affects the relationships. Secondly, within the managerial model, the leader is the visionary and the direction setter. In the family model, the congregation sets the vision and the leader serves as a facilitator and a guide in assisting the church in determining and implementing the vision. Now, as we look at leadership today, or the material on leadership, much is written today about the importance of vision and direction. And many of it is very good and excellent material. And certainly it's beneficial for the church of any size to have a sense of direction, to know where they're going. The problem comes, though, that in the the managerial model, the perception is that the leader, the pastor, is the one who is to be the visionary. In fact, I have read where some have said that if the pastor is not a visionary, he should step down as the senior pastor. That's so important, is it, that being a visionary and setting the direction of the church is foundational to the pastoral ministry. The problem is that doesn't work in a small church, because in a small church it's congregationally run. People want to have a voice. People want to have an interaction, just like a family. In a corporate model, if we were, for example, Bill Gates in Microsoft, Bill Gates would outline where he sees Microsoft going, and he would expect those under him to get in line with those directions. But can you imagine what would happen if Joe Father came home and approached his wife, who they had this mom and pa grocery store together, and he came home and he outlined and he dictated to her exactly where they were going to go in terms of the future of that store. Well, you can imagine she would probably have something to say in response, because it's a different model. There is mutual interaction. It's a sit down and discuss and mutually decide the direction that they want it to go. And so it is in the small church. In the managerial approach, the pastor communicates the vision to the board and the congregation, and then they rally around the pastor in moving the church forward. In contrast, in the small church, they often balk at any pastor who attempts to dictate the direction of the congregation. Rather, it's based upon the input of the whole group, which each member having a say in the matter. So the role of the pastor is not so much to set the direction, but rather to facilitate and assist and help the church in setting the direction that they need to go as they seek to implement God's purpose for the church. So they want a pastor who works with them in terms of moving the church forward. Thirdly, in the managerial model, the pastor serves as a CEO. He's the chief executive officer. In the family model, the pastor serves as a shepherd. The small church wants a pastor who relates to them as individuals, who ministers to them as individuals rather than in a program. They want a leader who is approachable, who provides guidance and comfort for them in times of difficulty. In the managerial approach, he's there to supervise the shepherding ministry. He oversees it by developing programs and overseeing the programs that are designed to minister to the needs of people. In the family model, there is a much more of a direct connection. In the managerial approach, the pastor's performance is evaluated based upon how well he leads and develops those programs, how effectively he supervises the programs and sets the direction for the church. In the managerial model, it's more important that the pastor ministers to the whole congregation than it is to each individual within the congregation. So he focuses more upon the whole rather than the individual parts. In the small church, how he ministers and is to each individual is more important than how he governs the whole congregation. People evaluate the pastor by how well he relates to them as individuals. So if we were to walk into a larger church and ask the question, how do you like your pastor? They might say something like this. Well, we love our pastor. He has set the direction. He's really building the church. If you walk into a small church and say, how do you like your pastor? Evaluate your pastor. Well, they would base that evaluation upon, well, how well does he relate to me as a person? Do I get to talk to him? Do I get to know him as a person? because it's more of a shepherding ministry. So the pastor needs to be more accessible, more available to each person. They're not content just to leave a message with the secretary or to talk with a staff member. They want direct access to the pastor. In the managerial model, the leadership makes organizational plans, and those plans then dictate the policy and procedure. In the family model, leadership relationships dictate policies and procedures. In the managerial model, they operate under the assumption that the health and well-being of the organization is more important than that of the individual within that organization. They're more concerned about the whole. In the small church, they're more concerned about the individual. So that in a business approach, when one is contemplating a decision or a proposal, they will ask, well, how does this affect the church and the direction of the church? In the small church, they want to see how it affects the well-being of each individual. If one person is dissatisfied or upset, then the whole congregation begins to experience tension. And the group's dynamics are drastically altered because of that. Because they focus upon the relationships that dictate the policies and the procedures. In the large church, the policies and procedures are implemented to protect the organization, the whole, the congregation. In the small church, they develop the policies and the procedures to protect the individuals within the church. Fifth, in the managerial model, success is determined by programs and growth. In the family model, the focus is upon stability and unity. The church in the managerial model measures success by results. They're more process or product oriented rather than process oriented. They're concerned about the end result. What did we achieve? And that is the determinant of whether or not it was successful. So they measure success by the health of the congregation, the location of the church, the growth of the church, the size of the programs, the development of programs. And when the numbers increase, people are satisfied. When the numbers decrease, people become dissatisfied and start desiring some type of change. In the small church, they measure success by relationships and inward experiences. The congregation is more process-oriented rather than product-oriented. The church is successful in the small church model when there is unity within the congregation and when people are caring for one another. The health of the church is measured not so much by the growth of the church, but by the absence of conflict, the stability of the roles, and the willingness of people to be involved in one another's life. So as long as there's unity within the church, people are generally satisfied, regardless of what the numbers are doing. Now, the danger of this in the small church is that in the process of developing these relationships, they lose the focus of outreach. Why? Because they become very strong in their fellowship, and because their fellowship is strong, they feel that the church is healthy. And so they begin to neglect evangelism. And so we need to challenge the church as they develop these closeness of relationship to never lose sight of the importance of being evangelistic in their ministry. We also find that in the managerial model, few make most of the decisions. In the family model, the congregation makes most of the decisions. Now, the larger the church, the more the decisions are made by delegation. In other words, the church appoints individuals who then make the major decisions. And only those that are the most significant, affecting the whole congregation, are brought to the whole congregation to be decided upon. But in the smaller church, everyone is considered to have an equal voice. So that the boards, and the various boards, make the minor decisions, and they do the research in order to bring recommendations to the congregation, but the congregation is the one who makes the decisions. Why? Because it's a family focus. It's a family culture, if you would, where everyone is viewed to have an equal opportunity to express their view and their perspective. In the small church, decisions are made by the whole, even when they affect only a part of the church. In the managerial approach, decisions are made by the whole only when they affect the whole. But in the small church, everybody wants to know what's going on. Everybody wants to have an input, even if it is not directly affecting them by that decision. So in the family model, the congregation makes most of the decisions. In the managerial model, the budget guides decisions. In the family model, decisions guide the budget. So that in a business approach, when a proposal is being considered, the first question is, well, how does this fit into our budget? Do we have this budgeted? And can this fit under our present budget? While the financial status is not the sole determinant, certainly is a very significant factor in making the decision of whether to implement a new program or make a decision. In the small church, they make their budget every year, and then they set their budget down, and then they don't look at it till the next year when they have to form a new budget. Because the small church operates based upon a need-oriented focus. The question is not how does it fit the budget, the question is there a legitimate need? And then they ask the question, if they determine that there's a legitimate need, then they ask the question, well, do we have the money in the bank? Or, and if the answer is yes, then let's do it, regardless of what the budget is. Or if not, then they'll do a special offering and give to the need in order to meet that need. So in the small church, they give to needs rather than to a budget. That's why I've always said that in the small church, the budget will always be, the church will always be right at the survival mode regarding the budget. Why? Because they don't give to a budget. They give to a need. But when there's a need to re-roof the church and there's nothing in the budget for it, there's no funds, they do a special offering, and lo and behold, there's plenty of money to re-roof the building because there is a need, and they give to the need. And so in the small church, the decisions are guided by the budget. Then lastly, in the managerial model, groups function independently. In the managerial model, you have numerous groups, and they function all independent of one another, and only when they may have cross-ministry do they interact with one another. In the small church or in the family model, the group functions interdependently, so that the CE and the worship want to know what's going on, because there's a recognition that what one is doing affects the other. And so they want to be more involved. There's want to be more of a communication process. There's a greater interest in what the other groups are doing, even though those decisions that they're making do not have a direct effect or bearing upon them. And so as we think about these paradigms, we need to recognize that yes, there's some strengths to these paradigms, there's some strengths to the managerial approach, there's some strengths to the family approach, there's weaknesses inherent in both. But we need to understand that the small church operates within this family model. At times it can be frustrating, at times it can hinder the ministry of the church, but we need to understand it if we're to be effective in moving the church forward.